Imagine you are the most powerful man in the Middle East. You control the world's largest oil reserves. You have hundreds of billions of dollars sitting in a sovereign wealth fund. Every global leader wants to shake your hand. Every arms dealer on the planet wants your signature on a contract. And yet, you are not fully free. Because for decades, your country's survival has depended on one single nation. One phone call from Washington that could either protect you or abandon you. And one day, you decide, quietly, carefully, without making a single public announcement, that this arrangement must end. And what he is building right now is not just a new army, it is a completely new geography of power, a map that no longer has Washington at the center. This is the story of how Saudi Arabia is rewriting its military future. Not with a war, not with a revolution, but with a master plan so calculated, so layered, and so quietly executed that most of the world is still catching up to what is already done. To understand where Saudi Arabia is going, you first have to understand where it has been. For more than 70 years, the relationship between Riyadh and Washington was built on a simple deal. Saudi Arabia would pump oil and keep prices stable. It was not a friendship, it was a transaction. A transaction written in oil barrels and fighter jets and the blood of American soldiers stationed at bases across the Arabian Peninsula. And like every transaction in history, it had a flaw. The flaw was dependency. The kind of dependency that looks like partnership until the moment one side decides to change the terms. And when that moment came, Saudi Arabia discovered that all the oil money in the world cannot buy you the one thing a sovereign nation truly needs, the freedom to make its own choices without asking permission. That single document became the foundation of Saudi security for the next 7 decades. By 1972, Saudi arms purchases from the United States had already jumped from $14 million to nearly $500 million in just 1 year. And that was only the beginning. The relationship grew bigger, deeper, more complicated, and more entangled with every passing decade. Saudi Arabia became the single largest buyer of American weapons in the world, not in 1 year. Over and over again, year after year, Riyadh reached into its oil wealth and handed it to Washington in exchange for protection. And for a while, it worked. The arrangement gave Saudi Arabia real security. American air defense systems, American fighter jets, American intelligence networks, and the implicit promise that if anyone tried to destroy the kingdom, they would first have to go through the United States military. That is the most powerful military guarantee on the face of the earth. But guarantees have conditions. The first cracks appeared quietly, not on a battlefield, but in a Washington Post column. The message was this: even your closest ally will sacrifice you when it becomes politically convenient. And then Biden broke his own promise. He traveled to Riyadh in 2022, fist-bumped MBS in front of the cameras, and asked Saudi Arabia to pump more oil to help lower American gas prices before the midterm elections. The world watched a sitting American president fly across the ocean to ask a crown prince he had called a pariah for a political favor. That moment did more damage to American credibility in Riyadh than any speech ever could. The relationship was always transactional, and transactional relationships can be renegotiated by whoever holds the better cards. MBS had been watching, and he had been counting the number of times Washington's promises came with conditions, counting the number of times American weapons sales were paused or canceled during regional operations, counting the number of times U.S. lawmakers threatened to cut off military support if the kingdom made choices Washington disagreed with. And he had arrived at a conclusion that would reshape the entire security architecture of the Middle East, not an exit from the relationship with America entirely. That would be too dramatic, too costly, too visible. MBS is not a man who makes dramatic announcements about strategic shifts, each piece placed exactly where it needs to be, years before anyone understands the full picture. The first piece was Vision 2030. Announced in 2016, this was MBS's public blueprint to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent kingdom into a globally competitive economic powerhouse. On the surface, it was about tourism, entertainment, technology, and manufacturing. But buried deep inside Vision 2030 was a military objective that most analysts outside the kingdom missed at first. The goal was to localize 50% of Saudi military spending by 2030. In other words, to build Saudi Arabia's own defense industry, to stop importing weapons and start making them, to stop being a customer and start being a manufacturer. Think about what that means. A country that makes its own weapons does not need to beg a supplier for spare parts, does not need to worry about political conditions attached to an arms deal, does not need to pause a military operation because Washington has changed its mind about the war. Defense localization is not just an economic strategy, it is a declaration of independence written in steel and circuit boards. In 2017, MBS created 2 new institutions to make this happen. The General Authority for Military Industries, known as GAMI, became the regulator and licensor of everything in the Saudi defense sector. And Saudi Arabian Military Industries, known as SAMI, became the state-owned industrial champion, backed by the Public Investment Fund, tasked with building weapons inside Saudi Arabia itself. In 2018, the localization rate of Saudi military production was just 4%. By the end of 2024, it had climbed to nearly 19.5%. The number of licensed defense facilities in the kingdom grew from just 5 in 2019 to 296 by the third quarter of 2024. That is not slow progress. That is a manufacturing revolution happening in the desert, and the ambition does not stop there. GAMI's National Military Industries sector strategy is built on 3 pillars: military acquisition, military industry, and military research and technology. Each pillar feeds into the others. The acquisition strategy ensures that every foreign arms deal now comes with a localization requirement, forcing international suppliers to partner with Saudi firms and transfer knowledge into the kingdom. The industry pillar builds the physical infrastructure, the factories, the supply chains, the training programs, and the research and technology pillar is designed to close the gap between purchasing weapons and actually understanding how to innovate beyond them. Saudi Arabia currently allocates about 1% of its defense procurement budget to research and development, compared to a global average of more than 4% and over 8% in the United States and China. Closing that gap is the long-term challenge, but the direction is set, the commitment is funded, and the institutional architecture is in place. SAMI alone is targeting a contribution of $3.7 billion to Saudi GDP, $1.6 billion in research and development, and 40,000 new jobs by 2030. The broader national target is $25 billion in GDP contribution and 100,000 jobs. Saudi Arabia allocated approximately $78 billion for its military sector in the 2025 budget. That is 21% of total government spending, 7.2% of the entire economy. Saudi Arabia ranked 7th in the world in military spending in 2024, just $1.5 billion behind the United Kingdom, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. This is the financial foundation of the Masterplan. But money and factories are only part of the story. The more important part is geography, and specifically, the question of who else, besides America, will protect you when the threat arrives. The answer MBS chose shocked analysts in ways they are still processing. On September 17, 2025, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a strategic mutual defense agreement. This was not a routine partnership announcement. This was a seismic event. Under the terms of this agreement, approximately 25,000 Pakistani troops were deployed to Saudi Arabia for security, joint operations, and training. Pakistan's defense minister then confirmed something that stunned security analysts across every capital in the world. He said the agreement extended to Pakistan's strategic assets. Strategic assets. That is the diplomatic language for nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia, for the first time in its modern history, was now sitting under a nuclear umbrella that did not belong to the United States. The timing of this agreement matters enormously. Saudi Arabia has genuine, immediate, non-theoretical security threats pressing on it from multiple directions. The Houthi movement in Yemen, still standing after years of airstrikes and coalition operations, retains the ability to launch missiles and drones deep into Saudi territory. On November 1st, 2025, a senior Houthi official warned publicly that the group could send Saudi Arabia back to living in desert tents and riding camels. That is not the language of a defeated enemy. That is the language of a movement that believes it is still in the fight. Iran, despite being severely weakened by Israeli and American military operations throughout 2025, still maintains proxies and capabilities that could threaten the kingdom. Israel's increasing military presence in the region, backed by Washington, has introduced a new kind of uncertainty that Saudi leaders must factor into every security calculation. In this environment, one security partner, even the most powerful military on earth, is no longer enough. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how the global security order has worked since 1945. Nuclear deterrence is not just about having a bomb, it is about the credibility of the promise that the bomb will be used to defend you. For Saudi Arabia to step under Pakistan's nuclear umbrella is to tell the world that Riyadh now has a defense option that Washington cannot easily veto or withdraw. But the Pakistan connection goes deeper than just a piece of paper and a nuclear guarantee. It is the vehicle through which something else is entering Saudi Arabia, something that changes the entire military calculus of the Middle East. In May 2025, Pakistan and India fought a brief but intense military confrontation. During that conflict, Pakistan's Chinese-built ecosystem of jet fighters, missiles, and air defense systems performed in ways that stunned Western military planners. Pakistani J-10C fighters using PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles, are believed to have downed several Indian jets, including some of the most advanced European and Russian aircraft in the Indian inventory. For years, Chinese weapons were seen as cheaper but inferior alternatives to American and European systems. That perception ended in May 2025. Chinese military technology had just proved itself in a real war against real adversaries, flying real Western hardware. The impact on the Gulf was immediate. Saudi Arabia's leadership had been watching the US-China rivalry with great interest. Washington had been making it difficult, politically risky, and legally complicated for Gulf states to buy Chinese weapons, fearing that Chinese technology embedded in allied countries could compromise American intelligence and operational security. The fear of US punishment had been one of the two main obstacles preventing deeper Chinese-Saudi military ties. The second obstacle was the question of whether Chinese weapons actually worked in combat. By June 2025, both obstacles had been significantly weakened. Now, Pakistani troops with direct experience of Chinese military systems are sitting inside Saudi Arabia, training alongside Saudi forces, sharing assessments of Chinese weapons based on actual operational experience. Not sales brochures, not airshow demonstrations. Real combat assessments from fellow Muslim soldiers with mutual strategic interests. The Singapore-based RSIS think tank put it bluntly. They described it as the dawn of a new security architecture in the Middle East, one brokered by Islamabad, built and armed by Beijing, and bankrolled by Riyadh. China had already been building its position in Saudi Arabia long before the Pakistan agreement. In 2022, Riyadh signed approximately $4 billion in new arms deals with Chinese firms, including a joint agreement to design and manufacture drones. China has sold Saudi Arabia-armed drones from the Winglong series, ballistic missiles, and air defense systems. In 2024, China sent more than 30 defense firms under the China Defense banner to the Saudi World Defense Show. The Chinese Air Force also displayed its J-10 fighter jet's Bai aerobatic team, the first overseas exhibition for that group, and refueled the J-10s mid-air using the Y-20 tanker, its first public overseas refueling operation. These were not accidental displays. They were carefully choreographed signals to every arms buyer in the world that China's military technology was ready for the global market. In October 2025, Saudi Arabia and China launched Blue Sword 2025, their joint naval exercise, at the King Abdulaziz Naval Base in Jubail, home of Saudi Arabia's Eastern Fleet. This was the third iteration of the exercise, and it included tactical drones and maritime mine clearance. Senior Chinese military officials described the drill as building both combat readiness and military friendship between the two forces. The third exercise. This is not a first meeting between strangers. This is an established military relationship that has been deepening with every passing year, exercise by exercise, agreement by agreement, until it has become something that Washington can no longer easily dismiss or dismantle. Saudi Arabia's Minister of Defense. Prince Khalid bin Salman had also visited Beijing earlier, meeting with China's defense minister and the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. The two sides stated their willingness to increase defense collaboration. Security committee meetings between Saudi and Chinese officials have continued at multiple levels throughout 2025. Saudi industrial officials visiting China signed memoranda with Chinese aerospace and manufacturing firms, covering areas that overlap directly with defense production. Superalloys, aerospace components, industrial capacity. Al-Monitor, one of the most respected Middle East intelligence publications, stated it clearly in October 2025. Saudi Arabia is not replacing the United States as its primary security partner, but China is increasingly embedded in Riyadh's defense calculus. Beijing has smartly identified niche markets where the U.S. has not sold, specifically armed drones and point-based air defense systems. And through the industrial cooperation framework, China is transferring knowledge, expertise, and manufacturing capacity into Saudi Arabia's own defense sector, creating a dependency that runs both ways. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy noted something critical. An agreement between RTX, formerly Raytheon, and a Saudi defense firm to jointly produce radar and air defense systems fell apart in 2023 because the Saudi company had ties to Chinese and Russian defense companies. The U.S. government effectively forced a choice, and Saudi Arabia did not fully make that choice in America's favor. Instead, it quietly deepened both relationships simultaneously. Russia's role in this new geography is smaller, but not insignificant. Saudi Arabia has signed defense cooperation agreements covering anti-armor systems and preliminary plans for advanced defense platforms. The potential for Saudi-Russian joint development of domestic air and land defense systems is part of a broader hedging strategy. Saudi Arabia is also maintaining military-to-military dialogue with Iran under the framework of the Chinese-brokered Saudi-Iranian détente, with high-level defense visits as recently as April 2025. Saudi Arabia is keeping every channel open, every option alive, every relationship warm enough to call upon when needed. And then there is Turkey. Saudi Arabia signed what analysts described as the largest Turkish defense industrial contract to date, a deal covering Bayraktar Akinci drones, the same weapons platform that changed the course of conflicts in Libya, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. Turkey represents something specific in MBS's geography. It offers military reach, operational experience in modern drone warfare, and regional political influence. MBS has been quietly drawing closer to Ankara and Doha, despite the fact that Turkey and Qatar were once seen as Riyadh's main rivals for Sunni leadership in the Muslim world. That reconciliation is part of the same Masterplan. Build enough relationships that no single power can isolate you. South Korea entered the picture with air defense systems and artillery. Brazil signed agreements on rocket launcher systems. France remains a partner in naval and electronic technologies. The United Kingdom is a key player in aviation systems, and Saudi Arabia has been pushing for inclusion in the sixth-generation fighter program involving the UK, Japan, and Italy. The kingdom's defense procurement is now spread across every continent and every technology domain. The United States remains the largest single partner, but the U.S. share of the total is shrinking in relative terms, even as the absolute dollar amounts grow. By the World Defense Show in Riyadh in February 2025, Saudi Arabia demonstrated the full scope of this strategy in public. 3 memoranda of understanding and a defense cooperation agreement were signed. One with Slovakia, marking bilateral defense cooperation with a NATO member state that had never before been part of Saudi Arabia's security architecture. These are not random events. Each agreement is a data point in a pattern. Each partnership is a node in a new network. And the network, taken together, forms a geography of security that no longer has a single capital at its center. Now, here's where the story gets even more layered. Because MBS did not build this alternative architecture by breaking from Washington. He built it while simultaneously extracting the maximum possible value from Washington. In November 2025, Mohammed bin Salman made his first visit to Washington in 8 years. He arrived to a reception that most heads of state would envy. A lavish welcoming ceremony, a meeting in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump, who had called MBS his greatest representative and said publicly, "I like him a lot, I like him too much." The Crown Prince came with a list, and he left with nearly everything on it. The Trump administration designated Saudi Arabia a major non-NATO ally. That designation provides expedited access to American military hardware. It is a formal elevation of Saudi Arabia's status within the American security system. The White House also authorized the sale of F-35 fifth-generation stealth jets to Saudi Arabia, reportedly for up to 48 aircraft. Saudi Arabia would become the first Arab country to own the most advanced fighter jet in the American arsenal. The Civil Nuclear Energy Cooperation Agreement, the right for Saudi Arabia to develop a civilian nuclear program, was formally advanced. And a sweeping set of bilateral agreements in defense, technology, artificial intelligence, and energy were signed. Saudi Arabia pledged hundreds of billions of dollars in investments in the American economy. The total arms and defense commitment in 2025 reached $142 billion. Trump called it a business triumph. But analysts who read the fine print saw something different from the narrative of American victory. Carnegie Endowment scholar Andrew Lieber noted that the results were actually mixed for Washington. Saudi Arabia received major non-NATO ally status, but this falls slightly short of the security guarantees Trump had already given Qatar in a separate September executive order. The nuclear deal was advanced, but not yet finalized in the way the UAE's was formalized with Washington in 2009, and crucially, the entire package was delivered without any Israeli normalization. Saudi Arabia got everything it came for without making a single concession to Jerusalem. Look at what actually happened in that negotiation. Saudi Arabia arrived in Washington asking for 5 things: advanced fighter jets, nuclear energy cooperation, a formal security upgrade, investment partnerships in artificial intelligence and technology, and crucially, no requirement to normalize with Israel before receiving any of it. Saudi Arabia left Washington with all 5. The kingdom's AI company Humane received access to the most advanced NVIDIA chips. Defense agreements worth over $100 billion were finalized. And the Palestinian statehood question, the one thing that would have cost MBS enormous domestic political capital, remained neatly separated from everything else on the agenda. The Jerusalem Post analysis put it with full clarity. MBS secured access to advanced American military platforms, nuclear technology transfers, and the formal reaffirmation of the U.S. security umbrella without making a single concession to Israel. The marginal utility of normalization had evaporated. The kingdom already had what it came for. And for Riyadh, that is not a compromise. That is a masterstroke. There is a domestic dimension to this story that most international observers underestimate. The Arab Barometer's 2024 and 2025 surveys documented public opinion across 15 Arab countries. The results were stark. Support for normalization with Israel and Morocco, a country that had formally normalized in 2020, fell from 31% in 2022 to 13% after the Gaza war. The 2025 Arab Opinion Index found that 87% of citizens across the Arab world completely oppose recognition of Israel. Saudi public opinion follows the same pattern. MBS told American policymakers directly, according to multiple sourced reports, that he could not normalize with Israel without provoking the kind of widespread domestic unrest that would threaten regime stability. He insisted on a concrete, irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood. This is not weakness, this is leverage. Saudi Arabia sits at the birthplace of Islam. It holds custodianship over Mecca and Medina. 87% of the Arab world is watching what Riyadh does. MBS cannot simply hand that over to Washington's diplomatic agenda. And he has not. Vision 2030 itself is running into real headwinds that MBS must navigate carefully. The Saudi Finance Ministry projected a budget deficit of approximately 101 billion Saudi riyals, roughly $27 billion, for 2025. Analysts from the Arab Gulf States Institute warned that if oil prices remain around $65 per barrel, which the U.S. Energy Information Administration projects as a realistic trajectory for 2026, the deficit could balloon to $56 billion, or 5.2% of GDP. NEOM, the crown jewel of Vision 2030's futuristic city ambitions, has seen its timelines extended, its budgets questioned, and its investor enthusiasm cool noticeably. Karen Elliott House, the author of a major biography of MBS, described the situation plainly. Over the first 10 years, MBS dispensed giga-projects as if he were Santa Claus. Now the budget is stretched by too many expensive projects, low oil prices, and failure to attract investment at the level the kingdom had hoped. This financial pressure makes the military strategy even more urgent, because defense localization under Vision 2030 is not just about security. It is about creating jobs, diversifying the economy, building an industrial base, and keeping the population employed and invested in the kingdom's future. Sammy's target of 40,000 new defense jobs by 2030 is as much an economic and political goal as a military one. The defense industry is being built as a pillar of national identity, national pride, and domestic political stability all at once. But here is what every analyst agrees on, even those who are skeptical of MBS's long-term success. The direction of travel is clear. Saudi Arabia is systematically reducing its single-point dependency on American military protection. It is doing so not by making enemies of Washington, but by creating a world in which Washington is one of many partners, rather than the only partner. And in that world, the power dynamic shifts, because a country that only has one customer is dependent on that customer, but a country that has 10 customers can negotiate with all of them from a position of strength. The Hoover Institution's Bernard Haeckel described MBS's vision with precision. Saudi Arabia aims to lead in logistics, transportation, technological investment, energy production, mining, and industrial manufacturing. It wants to be the economic hub of a peaceful, integrated Middle East. And for that vision to work, it cannot be seen as an American proxy. It cannot be permanently subordinate to Washington's strategic preferences. It must be able to say, in any room, in any negotiation, that it has choices, that it can call Beijing as easily as it calls Washington, that it can welcome Pakistani forces as comfortably as it welcomed American ones, that it can sign with Turkey and South Korea and Brazil without asking permission from anyone. That kind of flexibility, that freedom to choose, is the real end goal of everything MBS is building. Not just a bigger army, not just better weapons, but the credibility and the infrastructure to make sovereign choices without fear of being left naked and unprotected if one relationship sours. The question the world's strategists are now wrestling with is whether this new geography is stable. Because building a multipolar security architecture means managing multiple relationships simultaneously, each with its own tensions and contradictions. The US wants Saudi Arabia to weaken its ties with China. China wants Saudi Arabia to deepen them. Pakistan and Iran are both Muslim-majority neighbors with complicated histories. Turkey and Qatar, newly welcomed as partners, were until recently treated as adversaries. Russia needs Saudi oil cooperation through OPEC+, while also selling weapons to both sides of regional conflicts. Every relationship in MBS's new geography comes with a friction point. There's also the question of what happens when this system is tested. A written agreement is one thing, a nuclear umbrella on paper is one thing, but what happens when a real missile flies toward Riyadh and the question becomes not which country signed a piece of paper, but which country actually scrambles its jets and activates its air defenses? Saudi Arabia spent decades building trust with American military commanders, our American weapon systems, and American logistics networks precisely because real security is not just about treaties. It is about interoperability, shared intelligence, established command protocols, and the confidence that when the call goes out, someone on the other end already knows the frequencies. MBS is betting that by the time that test comes, if it comes, the new architecture will be mature enough to handle it, that Chinese systems will be integrated deeply enough, that Pakistani forces will be embedded enough, that the domestic defense industry will be capable enough, that the combination of all these layers will be more robust than dependence on any single protector. Whether that bet is correct is a question that history, not analysis, will ultimately answer. But one thing is already beyond argument. The bet has been placed, the chips are on the table. And unlike any Saudi leader before him, Mohammed bin Salman has placed them on every number at once. The Jerusalem Post raised the most uncomfortable comparison of all. Writing from the Israeli perspective, analysts drew a direct historical parallel. Iran in 1979 showed what can happen when a modernizing US-backed autocratic ruler moves too fast, alienates the religious base, and creates the conditions for a revolution that replaces an American ally with an American adversary. The article suggested that the slogan, "Down with the American Shah," could one day find an equivalent in Riyadh, "Down with the American Malik," the king. That analysis may be extreme, but it points to something real. MBS's power is centralized in a way that Saudi Arabia has rarely seen. He has consolidated authority over the military, the economy, the religious establishment, and the media. He has broken the old royal family compact that distributed power across senior princes. He has imprisoned rivals and critics. He rules the kingdom with a tightness that creates both extraordinary speed of decision-making and extraordinary fragility if that one decision-maker ever loses control. The National Interest noted something sobering in its December 2020 GOSF analysis. Washington has put all its eggs in MBS's basket, and that bet may boomerang. Once King Salman, aging and infirm leaves the scene, dynastic challengers within the House of Saud may see their opportunity. Waning popular legitimacy, tightening economic conditions, and the grievances of a younger generation with rising expectations could all converge in ways that MBS's carefully constructed image cannot fully contain. But for now, the Masterplan is moving forward, and its geography is unmistakable. To the east, 25,000 Pakistani troops and the shadow of a nuclear guarantee. To the northeast, a deepening military-industrial partnership with China. Joint drone production, naval exercises, technology transfer, industrial cooperation. To the north and west, a warming relationship with Turkey and the Baykar drone connection. Across the south and southeast, OPEC coordination with Russia, which keeps oil revenues flowing and gives Riyadh leverage over global energy markets. Inside the kingdom itself, 296 licensed defense facilities growing fast toward the localization target, with SAMI building the weapons that future Saudi soldiers will carry into battle without needing to call Washington for replacement parts. And at the center of this entire map, one man who made the calculation that the era of single-power dependence is over, that the world is moving toward multipolarity, whether Washington likes it or not, and that the wise move is to be standing on multiple foundations before the shift happens, not scrambling to find alternatives after the ground gives way. Whether MBS is right or wrong about the durability of this new architecture, one thing is already certain. The map of Saudi Arabia's military future has been redrawn. Washington is still on it, but it is no longer the only name on the map. And in the history of power in the Middle East, that is one of the most consequential shifts in a generation. The old deal was oil for security, simple, clean, and bilateral. The new deal is oil plus investment, plus technology, plus nuclear cover, plus drone partnerships, plus naval exercises, plus domestic production, spread across Washington, Beijing, Islamabad, Ankara, Moscow, Seoul, and Brasilia simultaneously. It is not simpler. It is enormously more complex. But complex is exactly what MBS wants, because in complexity, there's freedom. And freedom, true strategic freedom, the kind that cannot be revoked by a phone call from any single capital, is the one thing that 70 years of the old deal never fully provided. That is the master plan. That is the geography. And it is already being built, one agreement at a time, one factory at a time, one military exercise at a time, in the deserts of a kingdom that has decided it will never again depend on the goodwill of a single foreign power for its survival. The old world had one superpower calling the shots in the Middle East. That world is ending, not with a war, not with a revolution, but with a methodical, patient, brilliantly executed construction project that happens to involve fighter jets, nuclear guarantees, Chinese drones, Pakistani troops, and a man who learned the hard way that in the 21st century, the most dangerous thing a nation can do is trust only one friend. Because friends, as history has shown over and over again, change their minds. But geography, infrastructure, industrial capacity, and carefully balanced partnerships, those are things that stay. And MBS is building all four at the same time in a kingdom sitting on top of the energy resources the world still cannot live without, at the exact moment when the global order is shifting in ways that favor precisely this kind of audacious, multipolar bet. Watch this space. Because what Mohammed bin Salman is building in the Saudi desert is not just the future of one kingdom. It is a blueprint for how middle powers survive and thrive in a world where no single empire can any longer guarantee their safety. That is the lesson. That is the master plan. And the world is only just beginning to understand what it truly means.